Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Wednesday, October 20th, 2021, and on this episode, I'm continuing my series covering the papers of one of the most prominent Antifederalist writers, Brutus. And today I've got highlights from his 11th essay, where he begins his examination of the proposed judicial branch of government. He considers the power there to be unprecedented and has three main reasons that he expected it to result in a consolidated, centralized power in the new federal government and, at the end of the day, the destruction of liberty. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this show, all the archives for over 3 years, individual episodes like this one today. I will link to the original source documents plus other stuff that I reference so you can read and learn more on your own time. And then also over on our show homepage, if you scroll all the way to the bottom, there's a bunch of different categories of stuff that I've covered over the years. And at the very bottom, there's a whole category for the Brutus episodes. We've now done 10. This is number 11. I think you'll find it really interesting. You can find all the different platforms we're on. Of course, we live stream on the mainstream video ones, but we also live stream at Odyssey.com, which is decentralized and censorship resistant. We have archive video versions at Gab and Minds, MeWe, BitChute, Brighteon, BitTube, Hyper, all over the place. Everywhere we can be, Rumble as well. And then we have the audio-only podcast edition. Reviews on Apple Podcasts help us a ton. There's Podbean, Spotify. We're on Facebook Podcasts, everywhere. If you don't find us on your favorite platform, please do let me know, either in the comments or with an email over at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. I'm going to do my best to expand. The reason we are on so many different places is, first of all, we want to reach people on the platforms that they like to use. And then second of all, even if you don't like using one of these other platforms, it wouldn't be too surprising if you woke up some Monday, Wednesday, or Friday. Well, you're probably already awake like me, but you're looking for this show that you've been watching from time to time or listening to, and all of a sudden it's not there. Well, if you go to 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, you're going to find all the other platforms we're on. So if we get booted, or when we eventually get booted, you will find us on another platform. And before we get to the info that I want to share, a quick shout out to everyone out in the live chat. I really appreciate you being here. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one, there's Tim Martin in Arizona, Cheriton Farmer, Dixie Strong, Justin Morrison, Clay Kent, Floyd Looney, good to see you on a live one, David Spiegel, Justin and Ite Lander in South Carolina. That's a great comment. I'm not reading that comment on this later, maybe. That's funny. Good to see you. Patricia Dance, Keith the Hat Guy, good to see you, buddy. It was great hanging out with you at the Tom Woods 2000th. Joe Vasquez, Liberty Gal. I think you're in Dallas, right? Jennifer Coop, I think. Robert Scott Bell, my great buddy, who does a really awesome show Monday through Friday at noon Pacific time at robertscottbell.com. You definitely don't want to miss that. And there's also Sunday ones. Gardner Goldsmith, good to see you. Dwayne, Senator DT Melody, Fred Carpenter, first time, welcome. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to stop blabbing and start blabbing about the stuff you guys want to hear about. And I'll try to answer some questions a little bit later. So let's look at Brutus paper number 11. He starts it out with this. Of course, he spent 3 papers in a row talking about the dangers of standing armies. Actually, 4th one discussing militarism, covering the relationship between an unlimited power to raise and support armies, even in times of peace, in relationship to things like the general welfare and the necessary and proper clause. And in the forthcoming papers, the papers coming after this, he also relates some of those kind of what he considered general and indefinite terms in those clauses with the power of the judiciary. Because if you combine that together, and we'll see here in just a moment, if you combine the idea that, well, there's debate over what these clauses might mean in law or to the regular people, how do you think it's going to play out when courts start using that? If it's not super clear, he's warning, then it's going to be interpreted. And as long as you give human beings the power to interpret something, eventually they're going to interpret it in a way that expands their own power. It's just the nature of things. And so, speaking of the nature of things, he kicks off that 11th paper, January 31st, 1788, in the midst of the debates over ratification in Massachusetts, although this was for a New York audience. He says, the nature and extent of the judicial power of the United States proposed to be granted by this Constitution claims our particular attention. He says, it is of great importance to examine with care the nature and extent of judicial power, because those who are to be vested with it are to be placed in a situation altogether unprecedented in a free country. Here from Founder of the Day, which I cite regularly. You could follow them on Twitter. They got all kinds of nice short snippets on interesting stuff. Revolutionary War heroes and history, on founders, Federalists and Anti-Federalists alike. And they've done a whole series on these Brutus papers that I cite on every one of these episodes. But they say Brutus begins this essay with an admission that he's not the most learned lawyer in the young United States. And I think that's an important point. I don't actually see him actually making the point in the way that I am here, but really, if it's a document that's to be ratified by the people of the several states, a lot of it is written in legal language. And when you're reading the document, some things might have one definition to the general public in a lay publication, a lay dictionary, but some terms were definitely legal terms of art. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a negative thing, but most of the people who drafted it, most of the people involved in the Philadelphia Convention were very much well-read in law, even if they weren't lawyers, like James Madison, for example. So much of it is legal language, and he has to point out, like, look, I'm not necessarily the great lawyer that some of these other people are, but that's an important point. He says he further analyzes that the Constitution's section about the judiciary is full of complicated language, the meaning of which even the best lawyers disagree on. There was certainly debate and discussion over what this phrase or that phrase might mean, even at the time. And the way that we look at a legal document is it has the same force today as it did the moment it was given legal force by the people who did that for the Constitution. That's the people of the several states. And so you have to look to see how it was explained to people as what it would mean. And the general consensus, sometimes there is still some confusion, there's some gray area, is what the people ratified, the understanding that they ratified under. And he's saying, like, look, there is debate. Clearly, this was happening by January of 1788. Brutus then accuses proponents of the new government of using this complicated language. Now, you may have read some Murray Rothbard, his Conceived in Liberty series, where he discusses things like this. Brutus is making the same type of a case. He's saying some of the people supporting this use this complicated language on purpose as a distraction while making their arguments so they won't have to directly address the questions at hand. Here, for example, this is how Brutus put it. Its advocates know how to avail themselves of these phrases. In a number of instances where objections are made to the powers given to the judicial, they give such an explanation to the technical terms as to avoid them. Now, he discussed in other papers, for example, talking about things like general welfare and necessary and proper, where he was saying, look, this may not even be the real legal version of the meaning, but it's more commonly understood that this might play out in this way. And some of the things that he warned about, many actually, played out exactly like he warned. Now, here's from a paper written by a guy named, I know I'm going to get this name wrong, Shlomo Slonim, a law school paper at University of Minnesota Law School paper from 2006. And Shlomo put it this way: what concerned Brutus in the first instance was the use to which the court would apply judicial review in the service of national consolidation, and how this would threaten the independence and survival of the states. John Hancock, right about that time, was telling the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention when they said, hey, let's ratify this with these recommended amendments, the first of which was what became the 10th Amendment. And he said the powers reserved to the people will render them secure, not the checks and balances of the various branches of the federal government, according to Hancock, but the powers reserved to the people. So anything that consolidates power in the federal government takes away that sovereign power from the people, usurps it, steals it. It's treason against the sovereignty of the people, as St. George Tucker put it in 1803, but that's dangerous to liberty. The only way you can be secure is to decentralize. The judicial power, this is back to Shlomo's paper, Brutus warned, would operate to affirm and legitimate all the invasions of state power committed by the national legislature. That's a long version of saying Brutus predicted the Supreme Court would act as a rubber stamp. And in so many situations in our lifetime, the Supreme Court has been a rubber stamp on federal power, whether it's by affirming something that they've done or by refusing to take a case, thus affirming what they've done. I did an episode just recently discussing how the Supreme Court in 10 plus ways, covering John Whitehead from the Rutherford Institute, how the Supreme Court just in the last decade has really expanded the police state we live under. Here's how Brutus put it: the real effect of this system of government will be brought home to the feelings of the people through the medium of judicial power. In Brutus's words, the judicial power will operate to effect in the most certain, but yet silent and imperceptible manner. And I've got quotes from a couple of other people that kind of reaffirm Brutus's view. What is evidently the tendency of the Constitution. He was concerned that the tendency over time was to consolidate and centralize power. And when you centralize power, if you think in modern terms, if you set up a computer network, one of the reasons that modern computer networks don't go down as often as they could is because they're distributed system. They're sometimes decentralized. They're usually distributed. So if you attack one server, there's 5,000 other ones that keep things operating. So what you have in networking terms is something called a single point of failure. When all decisions or all things are required to go through a single point of failure, when that single point makes an error, it affects everybody. And the same thing happens with government. So the more you centralize power, the more that someone might be tempted to use that power. Well, someone is always going to be tempted to use power. Everybody, whether it's Jefferson or the people today, they're all tempted by that. It is human nature to exercise power when it's right in front of your face. So when they make a bad choice, it screws up everything for everybody, rather than just for the people of California or Texas or some other state. He says, every adjudication of the Supreme Court on any question that may arise upon the nature and extent of the general government will affect the limits of state jurisdiction. In proportion as the former enlarge the exercise of their powers, will that of the latter be restricted. So James Madison in Federalist 45 told us that the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government were few and defined. If we read through the document, there's about 30 to 35, depending on how you read it, powers that were delegated to the federal government. Those reserved to the states, James Madison said, were numerous and indefinite. And those were the things that affect the lives and liberty of the people. And it's up to the people of each state to determine if they want their state government to be involved in something. Healthcare, for example. Even Justice John Marshall, of all people, said that all health laws of any type, specifically, were out of the hands of the federal government. And so this shows us how what Brutus warned about, it actually started playing out very soon. So all the stuff that was supposed to be left to the people of the states have become more and more centralized, and the more centralized it is, the more that their screw-ups, which I guess I'm being kind of redundant when we're talking about government, their evil acts become worse for everybody. So you notice how Brutus said the power will operate in the most silent and imperceptible manner. Thomas Jefferson, a few decades later, Christmas Day letter to Thomas Ritchie, 1820, I believe. My vision is kind of bad here, even with the new progressive lenses. Okay, yeah, December 25th, 1820, he said, the judiciary of the United States is the subtle core of sappers and miners, constantly working underground to undermine the foundation of our confederated fabric. So he was noticing this playing out in practice just decades after Brutus warned about it in 1787. I'm not sure if Jefferson had those letters in mind. We can be certain he probably read many of them. He understood those arguments, but he was making the same case. Brutus was doing it through a warning. Jefferson was observing it play out in practice. Here's George Mason. In the summer of 1788, just months after Brutus's warning in January, here this is in June 19th, 1788, in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, he makes the same case. When we consider the nature of these courts, we must conclude that their effect and operation will be to utterly destroy the state governments, for they will be the judges how far their laws operate. And whether it's George Mason, Thomas Jefferson, Brutus, James Madison, we were warned across the political spectrum from the time that if you empower the government to determine the extent of its own powers, you shouldn't be surprised when that power grows, no matter who's in charge, and regardless of all the vaunted checks and balances of the system, unless we follow John Hancock's advice, James Iredell's, and many others, of resisting usurpations rather than relying on the government to limit itself. Back to Shlomo. He says, by legitimizing, it seems like is the right word to me, but I don't know. I'm not as well read as some of these people. By legitimating the expansive exercise of federal power, the courts would be contributing to the aggrandizement of the national government at the expense of the states. In the institution of a federal system of government which presumed a meaningful role for the states in partnership with the national government would be seen as a mere sham. We'll cover that a little bit more in paper number 12. And here's how Brutus put it. The opinions of the Supreme Court, whatever they may be, will have the force of law. And now he didn't like that because we don't like the idea of basically an unelected group of oligarchs making law for the entire world or for the entire country. For many ways, sometimes it is the entire world, because there is no power provided in the Constitution that can correct their errors or control their adjudications. From this court, there is no appeal. Now, he acknowledged in the previous paper talking about standing armies that this basically left the situation to resistance to usurpation. Now, if the way to deal with the federal government is to resist them, now he acknowledged sometimes that works, but it creates a dangerous situation. You don't always want to have to be resisting, but maybe that really is the only way to deal with government. Lysander Spooner certainly mentioned that some years later in his defense for fugitive slaves in 1850, which I covered just recently as well. Going back to Founder of the Day, he talks about equity. Brutus focuses, they write, a large part of the paper on the idea of equity. In his estimation, he believed that the Supreme Court was not only able to decide what was legal from the words of the Constitution, but what was legal in the spirit of the Constitution. Now, if I'm looking at my rental contract, can I make a case? Maybe some lawyer could tell me about like property law. Can I make a case that the spirit of my contract means there can be no sounds that affect me personally or something, and therefore the drilling that I've been getting below my feet for the last week and a half or so, I got to tell them to stop? I don't know, because it doesn't actually spell that out in the document itself. Maybe that's a bad analogy, but the idea of understanding the spirit of the Constitution rather than what it says in law gives a lot of latitude for people to determine their own personal impression of what things should be. This, Founder of the Day writes, he believed left up a whole lot to the whims of the justices. As a result, here's how he puts it. The judicial are not only to decide questions arising upon the meaning of the Constitution and law, but in equity. We don't hear that very much, but we do hear about a living, breathing Constitution, which in essence is telling us that they're making decisions about it based on the spirit of it. This is what they may have intended had they been alive today. So therefore, the words need to change with the times. In essence, a living, breathing, or legislating from the bench version of the Constitution is the Supreme Court acting in equity. By this, he writes, they are empowered to explain the Constitution according to the reasoning and spirit of it, without being confined to the words or letter. And the result? What did he predict? He said the judicial power of the United States will, he says not might, not kinda, coulda, maybe. He says it will lean strongly in favor of the general government. They still called it that. I should no longer call it the federal government. It's supposed to be a general government because it was dealing with general concerns, a few and defined delegated powers that would apply to everyone kind of equally, and all the specific internal stuff was supposed to be left to the people of the several states. We should call it the central government because it is the largest central government in the history of the world. So he's warning us. He's predicting that the judiciary will lean strongly, not kinda, not maybe, not a little bit, not ish, but strongly in favor of the general government, and will give such an explanation to the Constitution as will favor an extension of its jurisdiction. This is evident from a variety of considerations, and he gives three main reasons. Number one is that he views many of the clauses of the Constitution as having general or indefinite terms. Of course, we talked about just at the beginning here about how he isn't the best lawyer, but he can hear the arguments that the lawyers are making. Even in New York, out of the Philadelphia Convention, the James Wilsons of the day, who was probably the most influential Federalist when it comes to understanding the legal meaning of the Constitution, his State House Yard speech had far, far more impact on the ratification debates, the understanding of the Federalist position than the Federalist Papers, which were really just written as a marketing tool to convince the people of New York to ratify in New York alone. It was, of course, now we hear it cited all the time, and I think a lot of people put a heavy emphasis on the Federalist because then 1/3 of the Federalist is Alexander Hamilton, who, of course, was the worst big government guy of his time and was happy to tell the people, oh, yeah, they're only going to have expressly delegated powers. There's going to be no implied powers during ratification debates. But then a few years later, oh, well, I didn't mean that. He wouldn't even say that. All of a sudden, it was just a different story. And I think a lot of people like to cite the Federalist as being the most important documents on the understanding of the Constitution because you have Hamilton, and it's a really easy jump to support all kinds of expansive power. That's just a quick side note. I've probably talked about that before. Anyways, general and indefinite terms was his first major concern as to why the judiciary would lead to consolidation of power, would favor strongly the central government. Most of the articles, he says, the Constitution itself strongly countenances such a mode of construction. Most of the articles in this system, which convey powers of any considerable importance, are conceived in general and indefinite terms, which are either equivocal, ambiguous, or which require long definitions to unfold the extent of their meaning. So he recognized, it's almost as if, and when I first started reading through these, and now I'm going through them another round again today, I started thinking to myself, oh, I didn't realize they were having that debate back then, because I had primarily read, originally I had primarily understood, because one of the first books that I read on the history of all this was really The Complete Anti-Federalist from Herbert Storing, but I don't think I really understood what I was reading. I'm like, oh, this is really cool, interesting stuff. And I was still probably some kind of a commie at that time, so I didn't really grasp it. But as I went through it later on, I had primarily only understood the Federalist arguments, and the Federalist arguments were pointing out how, well, in law, this is what this means. This is what commerce means. This is what general welfare means. This is what necessary and proper means. It's the doctrine, the legal doctrine of principles and incidents. We know how this all plays out in the argument in favor, but then if you don't understand the argument against it, you're missing out on almost half of what the people were concerned about, how people were actually thinking of this. In places like Massachusetts, for example, ratification was nowhere close to passing. It was going to lose by mid-January 1788, and that's Sons of Liberty right there. That was a huge deal. So if people were concerned that these terms were not set in stone, were not concrete and very clear to understand even back then, we shouldn't be surprised that, as John Dickinson warned, that all artful rulers will do their best, and I'm paraphrasing, will do their best to give whatever meaning they need to part of the Constitution to back up the stuff they want to do. So that is number one, general and indefinite terms. And then he ties it in to the preamble. He's basically warning that even though he knows that the preamble is not supposed to give legal force to the document, it's not a delegation of power, it tells the spirit, the motivation behind the Constitution. It's beautiful prose. It's really well done. But he points out, like, look, if they're looking at this in equity and they're just trying to understand some kind of unknown goals rather than the legal meanings of the words, they're going to look to the preamble, and from that, they're going to get all kinds of stuff. He says this Constitution gives sufficient color for adopting an equitable construction. If we consider the great end in design it professedly has in view, these appear from its preamble. And he reads the whole thing, and he's like, we're going to cover this a little bit more. And in fact, he really gets into it quite a bit more in his paper number 12. So number one is that there's a lot of general and indefinite terms that even the best lawyers at the time were debating. And even though we know what the proper term may be, and he mentioned this in previous papers, other people in the future may use that to their advantage because we know that power corrupts. Number two, power corrupts and power always seeks to expand. He says every body of men invested with office are tenacious of power. They feel interested, and hence it has become a kind of maxim to hand down their offices with all its rights and privileges, unimpaired to their successors. The same principle will influence them to extend their power and increase their rights. He says this of itself will operate strongly upon the courts to give such a meaning to the Constitution in all cases where it can possibly be done, as will enlarge the sphere of their own authority. In corporation doctrine, I'm looking at you. Whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, the end result is that the court itself is injecting itself into all kinds of stuff that the founding generation said was not going to be anything to do with the federal government. And when the federal courts do that, and the federal courts screw it up, just like I was saying earlier, they screw it up for everybody rather than one locality or one state. He goes even further. Another reason why the courts might validate more power. Well, it'll encourage more power in Congress, and back and forth, and it just makes it worse and worse and worse. He says every extension of the power of the general legislature, that's Congress, as well as the judicial powers, will increase the powers of the courts, and the dignity and importance of the judges will be in proportion to the extent and magnitude of the powers they exercise. Another prediction that he calls out is this, and this one I think is actually, to me, this one struck out quite a bit, because we talk often here at 10th Amendment Center about how every election is the most important election on earth. And one of the reasons is because that person's going to have power to determine who the next Supreme Court justices are going to be. Every nomination process is the most important ever in history because they're going to make decisions for hundreds of millions of people for all time. Well, unless someone in the future, it makes the most important decisions for hundreds of millions of people for all time and changes it around. Decades and decades later. And once they establish a precedent, it doesn't go away anytime soon. That is basically a foundation that we don't want. And part of the problem is they're involved in too much stuff. If the central government was not involved in so much, the importance and how much money people throw at it would be very little, far less. And of course, the court would be as well. And this is what Brutus predicts. He says, I add, it is highly probable the emolument of the judges will be increased with the increase of the business they will have to transact and its importance. So he basically called it. He predicted. Some of the things he predicted did not play out or did not play out in the time frame, but this one he definitely nailed. So 1, general indefinite and indefinite terms. 2, power corrupts and power seeks to expand. And then 3, precedent. And precedent, the doctrine of stare decisis, is a huge, huge problem where the courts will actually we'll use the word rule, even though they're only issuing opinions and we should treat them as such. And when they're correct under the Constitution, We can cheer that. It just almost never happens. It's very rare. But generally what they'll do is they'll look at precedent, and oftentimes they'll go with what the precedent, even if they disagree with what the result is. And on the lower courts, they have to follow that in a lot of situations. He says, number 3, because they will have precedent to plead, to justify them in it. And that's what will lead in expanding power. Well, they've already done this. So now we have this precedent, and those learned judges some decades ago, they knew what they were talking about. Now we don't have to revisit that because they were already there, and that's how things are. The Supreme Court has spoken. How many times have we heard that? Go back home, nullifier, racist, pig, Confederate, whatever the stuff I've heard over the years. You're always wrong because the Supreme Court has told us that I'm wrong. Brutus goes on, he says, it is well known that the courts in England have by their own authority extended their jurisdiction far beyond the limits set them in their original institution and by the laws of the land. So we understand that the founding generation knew, and even the ones that we disagree with, and we disagree with them on both sides of this. Brutus made mistakes, and so did, of course, Hamilton, but Madison and Jefferson, all of them. But whether we agree with them or not, it was very regularly understood that if you look through history and you found a scenario play out a certain way, if you did the same scenario again, you shouldn't be surprised when the scenario plays out in that same way. And that's why Brutus was so good at citing history in a number of these papers. He's like, look what happened in England. Everyone should know this. And he gave this example of the Court of Exchequer. He says it's a remarkable instance of this. I will link to this original paper so you can read it if you want to learn that history. But really everyone understood that the courts in England expanded their own power beyond what they were supposed to, and therefore he was concerned that it would happen again. Of course, I covered the doctrine of stare decisis back in September of 2020, Supreme Court precedent and the Constitution. I will link to that in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And here's Brutus wrapping it up before he gets into his next paper. He says this power in the judicial, and I'm not certain if he's talking about all 3 of these together or if he's really just wrapping it up with precedent, because his previous paragraphs are all about precedent. But either way, he was saying these are the 3 reasons. General and indefinite the terms in the document that can be decided, of course, under the spirit of the Constitution rather than the legal meaning of it. Power corrupts and power expands. That's a maxim all through history. And using precedent rather than, again, the legal meaning of the document. He says this power in the judicial will enable to mold the government into almost any shape they please. So in his next paper, he gets way more into the issues of the spirit of the document rather than just the legal basis. He starts tying things into the preamble, the general welfare clause, necessary and proper, and other stuff. And I will cover that in the near future. Of course, if you're interested in the show, you like this episode, please help us spread the word. Reviews on Apple Podcasts, any other podcast platform, smashing the like button, comments, subscribing, getting notifications, all that stuff on the video platforms will help trigger algorithms of those platforms and tell them to show the program to more people. Our membership program starts out as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I'm extremely grateful for any consideration you can give to join us today, but don't feel obligated. If you can't, that's cool too. I just appreciate you being here and helping me spread the word. When I started this organization back in 2006, my goal was just to do some blogging and point out like, oh, everything that they do really isn't authorized. And I was hoping to reach 1 or 2 people. So I am so grateful for anyone beyond 2 people who listen to what I have to say about that. Anyways, I'll have to take a look over at the live chat a little bit later today. Please continue leaving some comments as you're able to. Oh, Floyd Looney is talking about, I'll take a look and see if there's anything here. Gun Eye says, without local support, the feds don't have the manpower to infringe on our rights, any of them, actually. And he was talking about the right to keep and bear arms. And that's actually, Brutus was talking about this as well a little bit too. The founders thought every generation or 2 would have to change that diaper. That's a good one. Power is like a waist, says bust a cap in your... Wow, that's a great screening. Power is like a waist. It only expands over time till the people's pants will not fit this bloated, fat government. And certainly, if we aren't there today, I think we're all dumb because We absolutely are. It's the largest government, the largest military empire the world has ever seen, and it couldn't be more bloated, especially in comparison to the limited delegated powers that the people have not kept the government in check. Anyways, I will look more through the chat a little bit later, just because I'm running a little bit longer than I had hoped to today, but you know how I get. It's just kind of rambling. Jeff Deist at the Tom Woods episode says, you know, you might find him on YouTube talking and talking and talking, however he put it, but it was pretty funny to me. So I appreciate you spending some time with me today again. Make sure to leave those reviews, smash the like, the membership program, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you learned something. I hope this made you think. It gave you some perspective to and interest into learning a little bit more. And thanks again. I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.